Tonight, as junior doctors in England are about to walk out for 3 days of strike action, can the government isolate them into doing a deal? The Prime Minister says he's doing deals with every other part of the NHS and the public sector, and junior doctors were offered the largest rise. With more strikes due after Christmas and NHS waiting lists already going up, I'll speak to the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Also tonight, Labour's under pressure to cut its ties with Israel's ambassador to the UK after she ruled out a two-state solution. And after Keir Starmer shared a pic from his student days, amazing, we've been digging out the photo albums. All that and more with Alicia, Kearns and Sonia Sodha, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Tuesday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Tonight, we're talking about the NHS because tomorrow, a full walkout of junior doctors begins, lasting for 3 days in December and 6 days in January. That's the front line of the crisis in the NHS, but really it goes much deeper than that. Now, first things first, the NHS is an incredible thing where what you need is more important than how much you can pay. And it's full of incredible people working there. I mean, we saw that during the pandemic. People literally putting their own life on the line to help others. And on a personal note, it's the place that held my hand through 2 pregnancies, the birth of 2 babies, a place I've called in an emergency, and straight away there were people to help. And everyone, all of you, will have something they'll always be grateful to the NHS for. But is it offering a gold standard of care? And will it in 5 years, 10 years' time? In other words, how healthy is the NHS? The time we're waiting in A&E, how difficult it is to get a GP appointment, how we're caring for our elderly, how we're supporting people through mental health battles. The truth is, we all probably have a bad story to tell about the NHS as well. And there are short-term crises like the strikes this winter that are closing some A&E departments. We'll be hearing more on that later on. And there are also long-term crises too, an ageing population increasingly suffering from dementia, to name one. And honestly, because in this country, the NHS is almost totemic, it's something we love, something we're proud of, are we always clear-eyed enough when talking about whether it needs to change? On the show tonight, we'll be asking some of those questions and talking to the man who could be in charge of the NHS after the next election, that's Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. First, though, here is Sky's health correspondent, Ashish Joshi.
Another winter, another strike. Except this time, longer than any other in the NHS's history. Patients and health leaders are bracing themselves. Junior doctors say they have no choice.
The aim is not to collapse the NHS, the aim is to save the NHS. You know, we must have doctors. You cannot fly an aeroplane without pilots, and we represent the skills and the expertise that patients need. And of course, doctors are leaving because of the lack of valuing them in the workplace.
The BMA says the government's proposal of an extra 3% pay rise for junior doctors, on top of 8.8% already given, would amount to a pay cut for many of its members after years of below-inflation pay rises.
It's very disappointing that the junior doctors have rejected the offer. As you've made the point, we have now reached resolution with every other part of the public sector and every other part of the NHS.
But consultants and specialists have yet to vote in favour of their pay offers, and the Royal College of Nursing also considers itself still in dispute. Over the coming 3 weeks, only 4 weekdays will be left unaffected by either strike action or the holidays. That's 4 weekdays in 3 weeks. And you can only imagine what sort of pressure, both operationally and financially, that brings on the NHS and its patients. And that's after coping with more than a year's worth of strikes. More than 1 million procedures and appointments have had to be rescheduled since industrial action began by health workers last December. And health leaders say these ones could be the most damaging yet.
There'll be a huge amount of concern around managing patient safety and quality during this period, because urgent care will be the priority. But a lot of planned care will have to be rescheduled for later in the new year.
Who's NHS? Our NHS!
It is too late to call off the strikes that begin on Wednesday, but there is hope, albeit slim, that both sides will still try to find a way to stop January's industrial action from going ahead. Ashish Joshi, Sky News.
Well, Ashish joins us now. More strikes starting tomorrow. Is there any sign of an end in sight?
Certainly not for the next 3 days that are coming up, starting at 7 a.m. tomorrow. I get the feeling from talking to people at the BMA, talking to people involved with the NHS, that there is some hope that the January strikes can be averted. But I'm certainly not saying that. Both sides are very hopeful of a good outcome. The NHS health leaders are bracing themselves for what will be an exceptionally difficult 3 weeks. We've not been here before. I know I've said that on your programme many times before, but each time it is unprecedented. We've got 3 days just before Christmas. Christmas is skeleton staff or Christmas rotas. And then you'll have 6 days over January, just coming out of that busy Christmas period. 6 days together is going to have a huge impact on the NHS's ability to deliver any sort of service. The front door to all acute hospitals will remain open, and that's it. Everything that's behind the scenes, all the other operations, what are called routine operations, and I hate that word, because for somebody who's waiting for a hip or a knee or something to do with their hands or their feet or their legs, that's not routine, that's life-changing and life-enhancing. They will all be paused, and we don't know when they'll be rescheduled. So that pressure continues to build. COVID's on the up, flu is on the up, ambulance handovers are taking longer. So all of this pressure building at exactly the wrong time, especially with those strikes being slated for tomorrow. Hopefully they will see sense and start talking about trying to resolve the January action.
Yeah, we can only hope. Ashish, thank you very much indeed for talking us through the impact of something I know loads of viewers are going to be very worried about. Well, let's hear now, shall we, from the man who wants to run the NHS after the next election. That's the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Great to have you on the programme tonight. Thank you very much for being here. We're on the eve of strike action. Lots of our viewers are going to be very worried about the impact. So we've heard about some A&E departments even closing because of it. How concerned are you?
Very. I mean, we've got to a point now where strikes in the NHS have seen more than 1 million appointments, operations, procedures delayed, cancelled, rearranged, great inconvenience to patients who are already waiting far too long for treatment. And this has cost us more than £1 billion. So it's the worst of all worlds. We are paying a heavy price for the government's failure to negotiate an outcome to this dispute, a fair outcome, and also the mishandling of the whole picture of industrial action overall. Let's cast our minds back last year when the nurses, this time last year, offered to call off strike action before a single strike could take place if only the government negotiated. They refused. The nurses went back on strike. It was really difficult to get them back. And they didn't learn from that, so we ended up in the same position with the junior doctors. They then settled with the consultants at a higher percentage increase than they did with the nurses, which has caused real insult to nurses. And there's still no end in sight with junior doctors. And I'm sure this is in part due to the fact that in the last 2 years that I've been Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary, we've had 5 Conservative Secretaries of State. I don't think that's serious. I don't think it's professional or competent. And I think the tone that Victoria Atkins's predecessors adopted with the staff in terms of those negotiations, the refusal to negotiate at all, I think it set them off on the wrong course. And you know, there's a reason we didn't have national strikes in the NHS when we were last in government. It's because we treated the staff with respect. We had the economy growing so we could invest in the NHS.
Well, let's talk about what you would do, because you're the guy who wants to be in control of the NHS. You want to be the Health Secretary after the next election. Would you agree to the demands of the junior doctors?
I've been honest with the junior doctors that a 35% pay increase is not something, given the state that the Conservatives have left the public finances in, that I would be able to deliver. And the way I see it, the staff are making...
strikes, then,
well, we
you?
haven't... No, well, no, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think with any negotiation, there's give and take. I think they would understand the constraints we're operating under. And what I've said is that the fundamental point they're making, that pay hasn't kept up in line with inflation, is a fair argument. But what I'm saying is to get us back to where we should be rather than an event, and we're going to have to try and negotiate a compromise and a route out of this misery for
Would you
staff.
give junior doctors a bigger pay rise than nurses?
Look, I want to look at pay in the round, and I've said, you know, obviously not going to pluck figures out the air or do negotiations on air, but I think it's a fair challenge to ask about the overall approach, and I think consultants would understand when I say, without any offence intended to them, the people I'm most worried about in the NHS at the moment are some of the lower paid staff who are really feeling the pinch with the cost of living crisis and feeling the pain. We've got staff going to food banks. So the lower paid staff would be my priority, and we'll do as much as we can, as fast as we can, but recognising that there are those constraints on the public finances, and that's why I'm being absolutely determined, along with Keir and Rachel, to make sure that we don't make promises that we can't keep. I don't want to say something to junior... I mean, it's the easiest thing in the world for me in opposition, say, don't worry, junior doctors, 35%, no problem.
I'll be coming back to you when you're Health Secretary.
And then break the promise to them after the election. We're not prepared to do that. So we are willing to negotiate, and we recognise that their pay hasn't kept up in line with inflation. We recognise the contribution they make to the National Health Service. But you're not doing what they want, though. That's the crux of it, isn't it? You're going to say, we're not going to do what you want. You're asking for too much money. But we'd be willing to negotiate, and also to look at a willingness to look at a whole range of issues beyond pay, but the wider terms and conditions that the staff are operating under.
Oh, come on, that's what lots of public sector workers get really frustrated about when the government says that, don't they? They say, oh, they're talking about all these different things, but we're worried about money.
And I can understand why particularly some of the lower paid staff in the NHS are worried about money. We will do as much as we can, as fast as we can, but we've got to recognise that the Conservatives have done real damage to our economy and to the public finances, and that makes the job of an incoming Labour government after the election, should we win, much more challenging than it was in 1997.
It's interesting. I want to talk to you about that because it feels to me like, look, the NHS is at a critical moment right now. You are the guy who wants to be entrusted to run the NHS after the next election. So I want to talk a little bit about what your vision is. I know you've got a dentistry rescue plan, you've called it, that you want to talk about today. What's that? Well,
we've seen from really stark research from the Nuffield Trust that NHS dentistry is on the brink of collapse. We see huge parts of our country that lack any access to NHS dentistry at all. DIY dentistry, people literally pulling their own teeth out, is on the rise. And tooth decay is the #1 cause of hospital admission amongst children aged between 6 and 10. Now, as with the rest of the NHS, it's going to take time to get dentistry back to where we want it to be. But we're going to start with a dentistry rescue package. That's 700,000 appointments a year in the NHS for dental patients, alongside recruitment incentives to those areas that are worst off. I mean, look at the northeast of England, the southwest of England, absolute mess there. And we'll also introduce a supervised toothbrushing programme for children aged between 3 to 5, because one of the big shifts we need in the NHS is a shift from not simply treating sickness but preventing it in the first place. And this is a tried and tested and fairly cheap, actually, measure that would keep children not just with clean teeth, but out of hospital. It's interesting to talk there about it being fairly cheap, and you, at the beginning of the interview, were very clear to say, look, there's not going to be that much money to go around. Does the NHS need more money? Well, we've made some big commitments, you know, £1.6 billion by abolishing the non-dom tax status for the NHS, which funds 2 million more appointments a year to cut the backlog, double the number of diagnostic scanners in addition to the dentistry rescue package, and just shy of a billion. But the case I've been making is it's not just that the public finances are constrained, and that ties our hands to an extent. It's also that we can't just keep on pouring ever-increasing amounts of taxpayers' money into a model that isn't currently working. So, for example, despite the fact that GPs are providing more than 1 million appointments now than they were before the pandemic, and despite there being 2,000 fewer GPs than there were before, people struggle to get a GP. That means that instead of costing 40 quid to see that patient, they end up in A&E, which costs £400. So not all of the answers to the NHS challenges are more money. It's about spending the money that we already have going into the system more effectively. And that's why I keep on emphasising that investment, important, of course, but so is reform. And if you don't reform the NHS, it's not going to be there for us in the future.
It's interesting because it feels to me like you are someone who is willing to say what I guess some people might describe as kind of hard truths about the NHS. You've run in with GPs a bit before. You've described them as GP leaders as blocking progress. I mean, do you see GPs as like vested interests when it comes to the NHS?
No, I actually see them as critical to the future of the NHS. We need more GPs. We need more activity in the primary care system, and that's GPs working alongside a whole range of other professionals. And we've got a big commitment to trial new neighbourhood health centres along the same lines as Australia, where I was just a couple of weeks ago, looking at their model. I do run up against sometimes opposition to reform in the NHS, and I think one of the things I've seen change over the last couple of years as Shadow Health Secretary, when I started out and emphasising reform...
Who's opposing? You say you run up into opposition. Who from?
Well, I think that there are people who sometimes hear the word reform and think, oh, God, like, is this going to be another top-down reorganisation? Is this going to be privatised?
Who work in the health service?
Well, I think people in parts of the health service, also sometimes general public, sometimes hear reform and they worry that it means privatisation. And I'm really clear about that. I don't want to see the NHS privatised. I want to defend an NHS that is free at the point of use. In order to do that, we need to modernise. And what I've been learning from in the last couple of years are some areas of outstanding practice in the NHS, but it's also exceptional practice. And I've got what my challenge will be if we win the election is to take the best of the NHS to the rest of the NHS and also learn from other countries in terms of how they are designing and delivering healthcare, because there's so much to learn from around the world. And having spent time looking at continental European countries, looking recently at Singapore and Australia, it's not the model of funding that needs to change in terms of the free at the point of use publicly funded service. It's the model of care. And when I ask the fundamental questions, why is it the NHS isn't the envy of the world? Why are our outcomes so much worse? And it's because we run pretty much top of the table for spending in hospitals, but you look at primary care, community services, mental health, diagnostics, we're either near the bottom, at the bottom, or seriously lagging behind. And that's why reform, I think, is even more important than investment.
We've been talking today on a separate issue about trans guidance for schools, which includes preserving single-sex spaces like toilets and changing rooms. What do you think policy should be in the NHS? When it comes to single-sex wards, for example, should a trans person be in a ward determined by their gender or by their sex?
Well, it's a good question. Actually, the NHS, I think, handles this very well as it is. And we need to make sure that single-sex spaces are protected in the NHS and that there is inclusive healthcare for trans patients, and most hospitals work this very well. What I was...
how do those two things... Just spell it out to me, then. You think single-sex spaces should be protected, so that should be based on your sex rather than your gender.
And trans people also need spaces where they are safe, respected for who they are, and feel comfortable. And one of the things that's really angered me about the government's handling of this whole issue of gender identity and trans rights is they've sought to take challenges and problems and exploit them rather than solve them. So, for example, Steve Barclay, the previous Health Secretary, it was his big thing in his conference speech, despite the fact we've got record high waiting lists, he sort of sought to stoke this culture war. And my worry, I sat there listening to what he was saying, thinking, well, I don't fundamentally disagree about the importance of sex-based wards in the NHS. But if you're a trans person listening to this speech, I'd be thinking, OK, but then what about me? What if I'm going into hospital next week? And I want people in our country to feel safe and included and welcome. And I think the way the government have sought to divide our country with these culture wars is ugly and divisive and unnecessary. And I think we've got to work together across the political divide. And on the, this thorny issue of sex-based rights versus gender identity, I think with a lot more goodwill and a much more respectful conversation, we can find a way through that maybe not everyone loves, but everyone can live with. We've been here before on equal marriage, for example, where there was a big clash on sexual orientation versus people's religious freedoms. We found, we solved that problem by working together and doing it respectfully, and I want the government to adopt more of that respectful tone, but I won't hold my breath in the run-up to the general election.
I've got one more question that I do want to ask you before I need to let you go, and it's about Labour's position on Israel. The Labour Muslim Network has written to Keir Starmer asking him to cut ties with Israel's ambassador to the UK is after she did an interview on Sky News saying that after the conflict's ended, Israel wouldn't accept a two-state solution. Should Keir Starmer cut ties with the ambassador?
Well, firstly, I think that's an appalling position for the Israeli government to take. There is no future and no peaceful future for Israelis or Palestinians that does not involve the creation of an independent Palestinian state. Palestinians deserve that same right to freedom and self-determination as Israelis, and I think the creation of that Palestinian state is essential to Israel's long-term security too. So I was appalled by what the ambassador said and what other leading members of Israel's government have said, and I think it calls into question Israel's broader strategy around the war and its war aims, alongside the disproportionate civilian casualties we've seen and the devastation it's wreaked on innocent people, including many children in Gaza. Okay. Where I would disagree with the statement from the, Labour members is we've got to engage with people. And we've got to make that case to the government of Israel. And so I wouldn't cut ties or stop talking to the ambassador. It's important we talk more, actually. But I absolutely condemn the one-state solution approach.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Wes Streeting. Well, let's pick up now, shall we, with our guest for the evening, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Kearns, and the Chief Leader Writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha. Good to have you both on the programme. Wes Streeting's quite punchy when he talks about the NHS. You know, he's saying, you know, we can't keep pouring money into a model that isn't working. Yes, I have run up against opposition in the NHS when talking about reform. I mean, is he right? Is the NHS not the envy of the world?
I think he's right that the NHS isn't doing well enough when it comes to certain outcomes, for example, early cancer detection rates. But I think there are some important reasons for that. I agree with him in one sense. Yes, the NHS needs reform. It needs to be doing more of the preventative work rather than acute care. That for sure is right. But then you've also got to look at resourcing. It's not just about resourcing, but we spend a lot less on healthcare and social care in this country per GDP than other affluent ageing nations, and you definitely get what you pay for. The other big factor when it comes to things like cancer outcomes in this country is it's also what you put into the NHS, not just money, but people's inequalities and the general health of the population. And in the UK, we suffer from this in the pandemic as well. You could see it in our pandemic death rates. We have an obesity issue. We have very high health inequalities. We've got areas in the country where health expectancy is going down. We've got high rates of air pollution. So absolutely, we need more funding for the NHS. We do need reform for the NHS as well, although I don't think that involves tinkering with its overall funding model. The King's Fund, an independent NHS think tank, says there's no evidence that switching from one model to another delivers any benefits. It's just a huge reorganisation. But we also need to think about the general population health, because unless we close some of those gaps, those inequalities, you know, you're not going to solve it with just putting more money into the NHS.
And Alicia, you're on opposite sides to Wes Streeting, if you like. But do you agree with him when it comes to the state of the health service?
I think we all agree that reform is needed, but it is difficult because systems as big as the behemoth that is the NHS are very slow to reform. Money does seem to just disappear. You know, it doesn't matter how much you increase the budget. It's a really frustrating one. And we do see other countries where there are models where people contribute more privately, for example, Germany, where, you know, many people would say they have a better health system. But I'm not necessarily sure that's the answer either. So we do need reform. It's not an easy conversation to have. And I think all politicians do need to be more brave about that, because actually even your most beloved institutions, you have to talk about reform and be open to it.
But resourcing is important because we haven't been funding the NHS to the tune of what we normally would in normal times.
I want to talk about strikes as well, because this is a huge issue. Lots of people will be very worried about the strikes that are kicking off from tomorrow. Where's your sympathy, Sonia? Is it with the kind of junior doctors or with the government?
I think my sympathy is with the patients. So, I mean, I do think there are questions to be asked of the government why it took them so long to get round the table with other unions too. But there have been agreements reached with some of the other unions. And I do think that the junior doctor, what the junior doctors are requesting when you look at it, I mean, it doesn't look reasonable. Pay increases of 35%, as you know, what Wes Streeting was saying. And this is going to cause so much disruption. NHS England has said there's basically 2 working days over the next 3 weeks that are unaffected either by the festive period or by strikes. This is, you know, literally as the NHS is moving into a winter crisis, it is going to have a huge knock-on impact on how the NHS copes this winter. And that is on junior doctors as well as the government.
It is on the government as well, though, isn't it? They haven't managed to find a solution to this?
I actually think the government's been really fair on this and the junior doctors being unreasonable. Let's look at the offer that was made. The least well-paid junior doctors were going to get a 10% pay increase. I think the average person watching at home would say, they said no to that. They said no to a 10% pay increase for those on the least money. Junior doctors had already had before this the highest pay increase of anyone within the NHS. So in terms of the situation they're negotiating from, I do think they're being utterly unreasonable.
But is that because of the decade of, pay restraint before? That's what they would argue. They're saying, look, you have to, you're all trying to make up now for, however many years of Conservative
I don't think it's fair
restraint.
at all. The reality is we have to be sensible. We have a limited budget envelope, and the reality is there are wage price spirals that we can get into if we are not cautious. We've offered enormous pay rises. Look at teachers as well. Highest pay rise in history given to teachers. We are putting the money where we are asked to do so. We are giving the pay increases. This is not reasonable. It's not fair.
Okay.
And to do it now at Christmas at the point of winter, I think it's deeply irresponsible.
Thanks, both. We'll have lots more from both Alicia and Sonia throughout the programme. Still to come on the Politics Hub. Well, Rishi Sunak was pushed on the civilian death toll in Gaza at the liaison committee today by, among other MPs, one of our guests, Alicia Kearns, will get reaction next.
breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. शांति से इनको समझाओ वरना ये हम लोग It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. What is feared that over 200 people might have died because of these landslides. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. This is one of the most sensitive areas of northeast Delhi where there's been clashes. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Hello, welcome back. Now, a new tax band will be created for high earners in Scotland. The Scottish Government has announced a new 45% band for people earning between £75,000 and £125,140. The announcement means that Scotland will now have 6 income tax bands, while the rest of the UK has 3. Sound complicated? Well, Sky's Scotland correspondent Colin Gillies has more.
He and his ministers for a number of days here in Scotland have been billing this really as the nightmare before Christmas. They have been saying this has been the toughest set of circumstances for any budget in the history of devolution. There was a crisis meeting of the Scottish Cabinet in light of recent events just a number of days ago to try and decide the way forward here on the tricky financial position that the Scottish Government is facing. Independent analysis of the Scottish economy has been suggesting that the government here has to plug a funding gap of around £1.5 billion. Now, that has been due to various factors, including inflation, but also those finance and public sector pay offers that have been rumbling on over the course of the last number of months. And the Scottish Government have been taking aim at those Westminster decisions in the most recent autumn statement. And that has set the stage for this new headline that we have been hearing in the last few minutes around this new rate of 45 pence in the pound for those earnings over £75,000, and also the top rate for higher earners in Scotland will also increase to 48 pence as well. Now, Scotland was already the highest taxed part of the UK, and this further reinforces that position here today.
Connie Glees there. Now, Rishi Sunak has been at the liaison committee today, and he was pushed on the civilian death toll in Gaza and whether Israel had violated international humanitarian law. Some of the toughest questioning came from our guest tonight, Alicia.
Biden has said that there were indiscriminate bombings taking place. Do you agree?
As I've been very clear, too many innocent civilians have died, and
so
we've
therefore
been very...
you agree that the targeting is indiscriminate. Therefore, if too many civilians have died.
I'm not privy to the precise targeting, but what I can say is clear that too many innocent people have died in this conflict.
But you will have received advice from government lawyers and submissions. Have any of those submissions or any advice you've received from lawyers or anyone within Number 10 suggested that international humanitarian law is being broken?
No, again, the government never comments on the legal advice it receives. Now, what is absolutely clear, I've been consistent throughout this from day one, we can't forget what happened. Hamas perpetrated an appalling terror attack on Israel. Innocent people were slaughtered, and Israel has every right to defend itself, to ensure its security, make sure that nothing like that ever happens again to its citizens. We would do exactly the same.
But there are also limits under international law.
And of course there are,
to
and I've made that
self-defense.
point from the beginning, and we've consistently called on Israel to do that.
Well, let's talk to Alicia, shall we? What did you make of his answer?
I found them quite frustratingly hollow because although he was answering the questions, he wasn't engaging meaningfully in what I was actually trying to raise with him. I think it's difficult for you to say that too many civilians have died, but then not therefore willing to take it to the next step, which is, well, why have too many died? I definitely disagree with the point that if this had been prosecuted by the UK, you'd have seen the same death toll, because I worked on the campaign to defeat Daesh, and our screens weren't full of news stories every single day about high civilian loss of life, despite the fact that Daesh was hiding in people's homes, despite the fact they were putting IEDs in children's teddy bears, all the appalling, disgusting things that we see Hamas do as a terrorist group. Daesh is playing the same sorts of tricks, and we did not do that. And this is the problem. It's about how Israel prosecutes what should be a counter-terrorism operation and not a war. And I do get frustrated when people seem to try and create some kind of equivalent. Hamas is a terrorist group. Of course they're going to behave outrageously. We have to hold them into account. We have to try and defeat them. But they're an ideology. We can't bomb them out of existence. And we also can't rebuild a meaningful two-state peaceful solution if you have completely destroyed what is left of Gaza.
What do you make of the government's response, and what should the UK be doing?
So what I've called for the government to do is create a Palestinian contact group, so essentially led by Arab nations, which brings together all the international major players on a regular weekly basis, or perhaps on a sustained basis. It would have 3 areas of work. So first, a political track. Yes, Netanyahu, yes, Hamas, or whoever the Palestinian representatives are not ready to negotiate, and Hamas shouldn't be a core part of the negotiations. But civil society and women, let's get them starting to have those conversations. Secondly, we need a humanitarian track, focus on how we get enough aid in. And I give credit to Prime Minister. What the UK has asked for on humanitarian, we have managed to get there. And the third track is an independent investigative mechanism, so we know what the ground truth is, so that we can make sure we know exactly what is taking place in terms of international humanitarian law.
What do you make of where the government is on this?
Well, I think what we saw there was Sunak trying to give sort of an answer that is too much of a verdict on what Israel is doing. I think that's very much what he wanted to sort of avoid saying, and you could see that in the answers he gave. I mean, I think what Alicia's just talked about, I'm not an international relations expert, but it certainly sounds sensible, because I think the question, I don't think there's any question, everyone wants loss of life to stop. You'd have to be a terrible person not to want that. The question is, when you're talking about a lasting ceasefire, what is the diplomatic route? How do we get there? And that seems to be what we're not kind of like really talking about enough. So it's really good to hear that, there's work being done on these roadmaps, because I think, on October, what we saw in October, everything took a massive step back from that two-state solution, which is what the UK government wants to see. So,
can I ask a bit of a silly question? What was it like, grilling Rishi Sunak? Do you feel like, oh goodness, he's a PM, he's kind of my boss?
It is difficult because he is from the same party as me. He is my Prime Minister. But at the same time, I came into politics because I wanted to change things. I came in because I feel passionate about foreign policy in particular. So when I'm sitting as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, all I care about is the policy. And all I care about is the difference we can make, because you can, in Parliament, stand up, and the things you say about something so far away, you can affect change and save lives. And so I don't see, for example, my committee scrutinising David Cameron as just scrutinising and looking backwards. I want to put forward solutions and ideas and push them to a better place. But of course, it's nerve-wracking. It always is.
Thanks both very much indeed. Still to come on Politics Hub. The government publishes its guidance on how to support transgender students. It says parents need to be at the heart of decision-making. Hello, welcome back. Now, teachers in schools and colleges in England will not have to accept all requests from pupils asking to change their pronouns. That's according to Transgender Guidance for Schools, published today. The advice was meant to be published before the summer holidays, but it was delayed to make sure it met the high expectations of teachers and parents. Now, it says that parents shouldn't be excluded from decisions taken by a school about children questioning their gender. Sky correspondent Molly Malone reports.
At this school in Liverpool, their attitude towards transgender pupils is etched on the walls of their gender-neutral toilets. Be kind is their policy of inclusivity. But what does that mean practically for teachers and children?
I can't remember what they were.
And how much clarity does today's guidance give them?
It will set possibly a pragmatic pathway, but I still think there are lots of areas that individual schools will be left to decide on their own. I think schools have a responsibility to educate children about different aspects of gender. When it comes to pronouns, I just think it's a matter of respect.
But the guidance says parents need to be at the heart of those decisions and any desire to change their gender or use a different pronoun. One of those parents is Carrie, not her real name. She was made to feel like she had no say when her child was questioning their gender at school.
They changed her name and pronouns without asking us. We were surprised that the school took this action without our consent, without involving us at all.
Her child, born as a daughter, identifies as a boy. Carrie says teachers chose to accept her child's self-identification without her consent.
It made my daughter very unhappy. She didn't want to speak to me. It was very scary. This was at age 16. And the deputy safeguarding lead told me this was all okay, because 16 is nearly adult, so that I didn't have any right.
That safeguarding lead took one view. Another teacher elsewhere may have taken another. So much of this guidance still subject to individual interpretation.
For a while now, schools and educators have been left to make their own decisions about how to and whether to support children who want to change or are questioning their gender. What's not clear is whether new guidance will do anything to change that.
The advice to schools is to keep toilets and changing rooms separate, according to a child's birth sex, and the same for sports. Schools should, the government say, keep them fair and competitive.
They have totally different physical characteristics that remove all sorts of fairness that you would expect to take place in sport. That's what the guidance is there for.
The reality is, it's only that, guidance, not the law. Some politicians want it to go further. And for teachers, there are still many questions left unanswered. Molly Malone, Sky News.
Well, let's bring in Alicia and Sonia, shall we? I actually really feel for schools on this stuff, to be honest, because it feels like they are in many ways at the kind of front line of a really difficult issue. Sonia, do you think that the guidance is roughly right?
I do, actually. I had a read of it today because it's an area I've written about a lot. I think it's very good, I think it's very solid, and I think it's based on the law. So as you say, schools have got to negotiate quite a complicated environment. They've got safeguarding responsibilities to children who are gender questioning, but all children as well when it comes to things like single-sex facilities, toilets, showers, sports. They've also got to deal with a changing landscape around the clinical view around what is best for children who are gender questioning. And we've had a very important independent review, the NHS, by a distinguished paediatrician, Hilary Cass. She looked at what's termed social transition. So that's when you may change a child's name, their pronouns, and treat them as though they are of the opposite sex because they're starting to question their gender. And she said that this is not a neutral intervention, it's a psychological intervention. And there's draft NHS guidance out at the moment that says, actually, if you're doing this, it should be with clinical input, ideally. So it's not really for schools. Teachers are not qualified to make these decisions. Parents obviously have a lot of freedom when it comes to the home, how they treat their children, what they call them. But schools have got a different set of responsibilities to children, and they do need to be doing what is in line with NHS guidance. So it's very tricky, but I think this guidance is as clear as it can be, given the complexities of the law and some of the conflicts of right. And I think it's done a very good job. And schools have been crying out for this guidance for 5 years. It's taken the government a very long time to put it out, partly because this is such a contested area. But I think they've done a good job.
I know both of you have been very sort of thoughtful on this issue. Alicia, what do you make of it?
I do think it's very balanced. It essentially recognises the right that, as a parent, if your child takes an action, so I want to dress differently, I want to change my name, how I want to be treated, that should be a conversation with the parents, apart from, as the guidance says very clearly, if there is a safeguarding concern. Of course, schools are better at understanding safeguarding concerns than anyone else. But it also really respects the rights of teachers to be able to make that judgment call. So if a child comes to you that's gender questioning and says, look, I'm not sure, I'm struggling, I'm finding this really hard, there is no need for that teacher to report that to a parent or to anyone else. It's about making sure that that trust with that child can be protected, but that once it goes to action where a child is actually saying, this is a path I want to pursue, then of course parents should be involved in that discussion.
We haven't got long on the chat, but it is, as you both say, you know, it's been very political. It's almost been treated as a bit of a wedge issue. Do you think it's still got that heat to it, or are we starting to see a bit more reasonable?
I think it's getting better. So I think, it's been very, very contested. It hasn't been helped, actually, by people who should know better. And I'm talking about charities who, have misrepresented the law to schools, for example. So this debate has not always been treated, I think, with the respect that it should. At the end of the day, what's most important is child well-being and what's best for children. And ideology has no place in this debate, but I think actually on all sides, but particularly actually some of the charities, they've been pushing the idea that if a child is questioning their gender, it means they have a fixed trans identity, an adult fixed trans identity. That is an ideology that is not grounded in evidence about child well-being.
There's a split of opinion in your party as well on this, isn't there?
I think my concern actually is more the way in which children and trans people have been used as a political football. This is not a wedge issue. I think it affects about 7% of the population in total. And I think it's really disappointing that people keep wanting to make this some kind of extremist issue where we can divide and shout about it. There are vulnerable people who deserve our protection and our support, and the lack of respect in the conversation about this is what really frustrates me. And I do actually think that's the biggest failing that we have seen so far in this discussion.
And I know both of you come from slightly different perspectives on this, but it's nice to have a respectful and a reasonable debate on it as well. So thank you very much. Now, Michael Gove has promised to take on councils which drag their feet over house building, saying they may have planning powers taken away from them. The Housing Secretary also announced a new development body that will oversee building 150,000 homes in Cambridge, and the statutory body will have the power to compulsorily purchase land. I'm not doing very well on this, am I? Right. Labour said the announcement was through the looking glass, as the government had already watered down its target to build 300,000 homes a year. Tamara Cohen reports.
How to solve the chronic housing shortage. The Housing Secretary says it's time to get tough with councils which don't build.
There is now no excuse for any local authority not to have a plan in place. No excuse not to ensure that homes are delivered swiftly and efficiently through their plan, and no excuse for leaving communities and the next generation without the homes they need.
But that doesn't mean building everywhere.
There are perfectly reasonable reasons to resist development if it is unattractive, if it's unaccompanied by infrastructure, if it dramatically changes the character of an area.
He confirmed councils will no longer have to meet strict housing targets, and that's worried the industry.
But the news today, the messages from the Housing Secretary has sent out, will be received by some as to say we don't have to build any homes in the near future in our areas.
The problem the Conservatives have with housing is that they are split. Some concede that not building enough homes will cost them votes at the next election, but others fear allowing unpopular housing to go ahead. Michael Gove has promised to get the system moving, but in some areas they say the government's policies are having the opposite effect. This site in Cheltenham had a development of 350 homes approved by the council. 40% of them affordable homes, until Michael Gove's Levelling Up department put the brakes on it.
We have protected 26 hectares of green space, but the concession was, if you're going to protect some green spaces, you have to allocate some land for housing. And young people would not forgive us if we never built any houses on green spaces, I don't think. But for the last 6 months, it's been stuck in Michael Gove's in tray.
Cheltenham is held by the Conservatives with a majority of just 1,000 votes.
Can't really afford a house. Working really hard. I think it will take me as an engineer a few years just to save for a mortgage.
I think if you've said you're going to build new homes for people and you've been voted in on that basis, then you should go ahead.
Labour have promised to restore housing targets if they win the election and even build on some green belt. Where we build homes could be a key dividing line. Tamara Cohen, Sky News.
Coming up on the Politics Hub. Keir Starmer tells University Alumni magazine when he was at Leeds he didn't think he'd ever go into politics. Oh, and apparently his staple meal was spaghetti bolognese. So we're talking student days next.
There are lots of British companies that sell trophy hunting things throughout the world, in Africa and places like that.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, at this time of the year, at a time of peace and goodwill on earth for everyone, I know it's a bit of a cliche, to even contemplate, and look at this beautiful, beautiful creature,
Yeah.
to contemplate the fact that there is a British company that is selling hunting trips to those psychopathic amateurs that go out on these hunting trips and don't actually do the job very, very well. Very often they shoot the poor deer and they don't kill it instantly. It's an absolutely appalling hobby for psychopaths. And I think it's particularly upsetting to see this happen at a time when children are encouraged to love Santa and the reindeers. I think they want to shoot the reindeer when they've lost that kind of green furriness on their horns, and it's just dreadful, isn't it? I mean, I don't understand how anyone can take pleasure out of killing a beautiful creature. I do personally believe that it is the occupation of psychopaths. And they do remind me so much of serial killers, you know, who do the most appalling things to human beings, and then they like to keep a little trophy, a trinket, to remind them of the dreadful pleasure they got from destroying beauty. I mean, I don't think that many that people are misguided about booking a holiday that is going to involve them taking a high-powered rifle with them to another country. The advice I would give to anyone who is thinking about doing it just off the cuff is develop and listen to your compassion, because it's the most disgusting thing you can do. They have introduced a problem in these countries because they've taken the natural predator, the wolf, out of the game. So they are forced to kind of have a culling system. So if you're going to have a culling system, then do it properly. Have an expert marksman who is actually going to do it, have a clean kill, rather than an amateur who is pretending to be a hunter, going out and doing the job very badly, in my opinion.
Hello, welcome back. Student days. Essay crises, pints of cider and black, embarrassing political debates late into the night, then nodding off in lectures the next day. Not me, obviously. And then, for many of us, mountains of debt when you graduate. Well, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has been reminiscing about his time at Leeds University. He's given an interview to the University Alumni magazine describing how he rocked up with a Bootown Rats album under one arm and a Status Quo album under the other. Turned out all right, though, didn't he? He graduated with a first in law, but that, of course, got us thinking about student days. So we thought we'd open up the photo album. This is the part of the show that I am the most excited about, I have to say. Here's Keir Starmer, looking quite dapper, actually.
Yeah, very smart with that thin little red tie, maybe a sign of things to come.
He had more notice as well that he needed to provide a student photo. So.
That's true, not like scrabbling around like we were this afternoon.
Well, talking about, that scrabbling around, we did decide that we're going to show you a little glimpse into our Student Days album. Here's Alicia
Yeah.
Bottle of beer in hand, is that?
And I hate beer, but I was still courting my husband at that point in time, and he was a beer fan, so therefore I was drinking beer. He was about to row past, so yeah.
That's lovely.
Is it though, desperately drinking the thing that your boyfriend does because you're so in love with him? I'm not sure if that's the greatest girl power message I've ever seen in my life.
Nice picture. Sonia, let's have a look at Sonia's picture. I love these.
That's me just so happy to be all done in the first one.
You look very happy.
I do, yeah. I mean, I had a good time when I was a student. What can I say? I'm not so sure that I had many of those political conversations going on late into the night. But I certainly fell asleep in my lectures.
But if I went back now, I would
it.
do so much more work. Once you've realised the reality of actual workplace, like you would do a lot more if you got the chance to go back.
These are my pictures. It's only fair.
Can't wait to see them.
Oh. There's me. Look so young.
It's so
I think you look the same, actually.
Oh, thanks.
You can come again. Thank you.
Look far too young.
Oh, and that's the other one I've got.
Were you a thespian? Did you do theatre?
Not at university. I didn't do a lot at university, I'll be honest.
Yeah, ditto.
We were talking...
Your lectures?
Lots of lectures, obviously, very studious.
I did go to mine.
We were talking about Keir Starmer saying that his go-to meal was spaghetti bolognese and confessing that
It's still my go-to meal. My husband makes the best spaghetti bolognese, and every time he cooks it, he puts in a new herbal spice or ingredient and tries to get me to guess what he's put in, which is...
Do you know what my secret is for bolognese?
I know, yeah.
Do you know what I put in my bolognese? So I always add a dash of ketchup. I learnt to do that quite a while ago. It's really good. Top chefs do that. I also, for umami, put in Marmite.
Marmite?
Yeah.
I had chorizo, that's my one. It has to be chorizo.
I love this. These are great
Stick
tips.
a bit of Marmite in your bolognese and it will give a really rich sort of je ne sais quoi.
You know, it's my favourite meal, spaghetti bolognese. I love it. But I have come on because, I'll be completely honest, I was so bad at cooking when I was at university. My friend staged an intervention, pot noodles, smash, a lot of smash.
No.
If I was feeling, particularly good, it would be like pasta with grated cheese. But,
So my best friend was Vietnamese at university, so she was the most amazing chef. Her name's Tao, and so I was so lucky. She's made the most amazing food. She made the amazing food. I would plan where we were going out to party afterwards. And
Perfect.
That's how it worked. So it was,
I imagine you're quite a good cook on the quiet, are you?
I do enjoy a bit of cooking, actually, yeah. Although, I've just given my top secrets away. I'm sure there'll be some chefs who are like, what? Marmite?
I reckon...
It really works.
Try the chorizo, though.
Oh, I will do.
It's a game changer for spag bowl.
Anchovies are also amazing in a bolognese. So you just fry up a bit of anchovies in their own oil with garlic first before you add the mince.
And write some notes. This is excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent content.
But smash is... I mean, some of my friends at university, we had a friend called Geordie Andy, and all he ate was eggy bread, a mix of 3 different cereals with warm milk, and if he didn't have one of the cereals, he wouldn't have it at all, and then smash. And that was like...
Cereals with warm milk? Oh, that sounds great.
I know.
I used to have, those packets of rice, flavoured rice you get from the supermarket.
Use those.
I cook them up and would just chuck some tuna in and that would be my dinner.
But very healthy. Well done, everyone. But look at us. It all worked out all right in the end, just about. We're still alive. That's good, miraculously. That is it from us tonight. Thanks for a very lively chat. I'll see you tomorrow at 7. But up next, it is SJ with the UK Tonight.